So, the National Park Service Centennial. I'm sure this is not a new idea to you. It has been widely publicized. There's been advertising going on for the last year asking us all to find our park. And it looks like you have found at least one of your parks here in Glacier National Park this week. So you have found your park, but I wonder if you've thought about what that really means. What is it that you have found? What kind of park are we talking about? Because there are lots of different kinds of parks. There are parks that have lots of different missions, lots of different reasons that people go to those parks. And national parks are a little bit different from some of those others. Of course, one of the unique things about a national park is that it's federal land. And this map shows you that there's actually a whole lot of federal land in our country, primarily in the West. But that's not actually all National Park Service areas. When you look at the map, or to back up, a lot of those national park areas, or federal lands rather, are operated by a variety of federal agencies. And these agencies have different missions. They're all equally important, but they have very different purposes, different rules and regulations, different kinds of activities that go on in these different federal lands. Here's a map that shows the National Park Service operated lands. They're green on that map, and it's hard to even pick them out compared to the purple federal lands. Those NPS areas are a very small percentage of federal lands overall. So the idea of federally protecting lands as parks is sometimes attributed to the first suggestion coming from an artist named George Catlin. George Catlin was an American artist. He was somebody who spent multiple trips coming out to the Dakotas, coming out to the Great Plains. He sort of specialized in creating art to show the lives and the colorful not costumes, but clothing of the native people of the Midwest and the Central Plains. And so George Catlin first suggested in 1832 that he was concerned that both the wildlife, the natural vegetation, and especially the native people of our country were disappearing. And he suggested that the federal government should set aside land as a nation's park to preserve those things. Now that idea was written down and passed around a little bit by George Catlin and his readers, but it didn't really go anywhere at that point. Another man who actually got his ideas listened to by a greater audience was John Muir. And of course, John Muir, the Scottish American, spent much of his life in the Sierras and became very involved in wanting to protect that area of the United States. John Muir did a lot of writing. He got quite a following for his published works. He became sort of a rock star personality that people went out to meet in the woods. And so people really did listen to John Muir and spread his ideas of conservation. And of course, the land that he was primarily concerned with was the Yosemite Valley. And so through his attention to that area, people in California started to want to protect the Yosemite Valley. And that did happen in 1864. At that point, the federal government set aside the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove to be protected lands. So it was protected by the federal government, but the federal government had an awful lot going on in 1864. California was really far away. There was a war going on. Our country was torn apart. So as soon as the federal government set aside that land, they handed it over to the state of California to actually manage. Of course, Yosemite eventually became a national park, but it's not our country's first national park because it was really given to the state of California to operate in those early years. And as I'm sure you know, our first national park in the United States, the first national park in the world, was Yellowstone. Yellowstone set aside by Congress in 1872. And this was an amazing idea. Our country really benefited by being able to look at what had happened in other countries where the best places always went to the most powerful people and the people with the most money. And instead, our government decided that some of the best places could be preserved for the common folk. And it was a unique idea to set aside these lands for the American public. So after Yosemite, or after Yellowstone was set aside, there was a quick succession of other national park areas that were established by Congress in various parts of the West. And then in 1906, there got to be a new way to protect some of these federal lands. In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act into being, and that was the legislation which allowed presidents to actually protect land through a presidential proclamation, and that's how national monuments came into being. National monuments were originally set aside, as sort of the act name implies, Antiquities Act. The idea was first to protect native early areas, archaeological sites, and also areas of scientific interest, but it has been expanded to protect areas of all sorts of significances over the years. So when Glacier was set aside as a national park in 1910, we were the 10th national park to be established in the United States. And still, there was no unified organization overseeing all of these national parks. The national parks were primarily places out in the West, as I said. They were places that really weren't getting much attention from the federal government. Congress would establish the national parks, but most of the parks had no budget when they were first established. They didn't have many employees. They really didn't have any unified voice, and the American public really wasn't terribly aware of many of these national parks. And so there were different entities that were running national parks. Some national parks were being run by the War Department. Some national parks had independent superintendents, and for a large part of the places, the railroads were the entities that had the most power and were putting the most money into some of these national parks. The railroads had an economic interest in getting people to national parks. And so places like Glacier, the hotels were built by the railroads. The publicizing of the national parks was often done by the railroad companies. So there was interest in having a unified entity to run these national parks. And a man named Stephen Mather was brought to Washington, D.C., and he was brought by Franklin Lane, the Secretary of the Interior at that point, specifically to create a national park system. Stephen Mather was a very well-to-do, successful businessman at that point in his life, and so he had a lot of experience organizing things, a lot of experience getting attention for causes. He was passionate about the national parks, especially in the state of California. And so he was driven to come out and basically donate his time. He originally agreed to work for Secretary Lane for 1 year to try to organize a national park service. And he was assisted in that effort by a gentleman named Horace Albright, who was just a very young attorney at that time. He had just come to work for Franklin Lane in Washington, D.C. And the two of them together were given the job of creating a unified system to get attention and funding for national parks. Now, because getting that attention was one of the primary tasks they had, one of the first things that Mather and Albright did was they got some publicists on board. Mather actually put forth a lot of his own private money and got the railroads to chip in money as well to publish this National Parks Portfolio, which was a series of little pamphlets with photographs and text about the various national parks. They had those for sale throughout the country, and more importantly, they gave one to every member of Congress to get them on board and lobby for their attention and support for national parks. So the two spent about 1.5 years getting attention for the national parks, and finally, in August of 1916, so 100 years ago this month, August 25th, Congress did pass the National Park Service Organic Act. And now I don't expect you to be able to read all of the text on here. A lot of it's just legalese. There are all sorts of things in here that are outdated now. For instance, the National Park Service will have one messenger paid $600 per year. But the significant part of the National Park Service Organic Act is really one long sentence. And it's a long sentence that has become our mission statement in the National Park Service. It's kind of like our Constitution. It's something that has been interpreted differently at different times by different people, but has continued to give guidance for the National Park Service throughout the years. And that significant sentence from the National Park Organic Act says the purpose of the National Park Service is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And it's a profound sentence, it's a profound mission statement, and it's actually a fairly complex mission statement because it has two different ideas that can be considered in conflict. On the one hand, it says that national parks are here to be enjoyed by people. That's certainly why all of us are here this week. But then it also is saying that national parks are vital for the preservation of the natural resources and the historic resources out there. So there gets to be quite the tension, because I know if I were to interview everyone in this room, each of us would have a slight different idea about what services we need in order to enjoy a national park. Now, those early national parks were established primarily because of things like scenic beauty or oddities. Yellowstone was really established because it was weird. There was all this bubbling hot water that would squirt into the air. Or some national parks were established because they had the grandest of something, the biggest trees, the biggest forests. Or because of antiquities that were being protected. And as I said, those national parks that were first established were all in the West. So one of the first things that Stephen Mather and Horace Albright realized was they needed to get more public support for national parks. They needed to get public out there to experience national parks in order to be national park supporters, in order to help make sure that Congress cared enough about national parks to appropriate money for national parks. And so Mather and Albright knew that with the parks in the West and the population primarily in the East, there was a disconnect between those two things. So one of their first missions was to establish some national parks in the East, closer to the largest population of our country. And this is the first national park that was established east of the Mississippi River. Do you know which one this is? Acadia, yeah. Acadia had multiple different dates of establishment depending on how you look at it, but 1919 was when it actually became a national park. Then they went on to establish in the 20s other national parks in the East, such as Shenandoah and Great Smoky Mountains, Mammoth Cave. Now those got kind of complicated because those were national parks that were being established where there were already some fairly significant populations. You may not realize, but those are national parks that were established where there were already communities, where there were farms, where there were orchards. And so establishing those eastern national parks meant displacing hundreds and hundreds of people. Although that actually isn't unique to the East. That happened in the western national parks, including Glacier right here. So as the 20s went on, other areas were added to the national park system. Again, primarily in the East, we took over, or didn't take over, but the national parks were given the responsibility of running a number of the historic sites that had already been run by other agencies in the federal government. And then in 1933, there was a major reorganization of these federal lands, and all sorts of national war sites that had been run by the War Department were put under the supervision of the National Park Service. So the system grew dramatically with the addition of those battlefields and national cemeteries and whatnot, primarily back east. So into the 30s, again, the goal for Mather and Albright was to get people out into national parks, to get them to feel connected with these federally protected areas. And here in Glacier National Park, one of the things that Stephen Mather was personally interested in was the establishment of a road through the park. In those early years, people would come to Glacier on the railroad, they would travel by horseback, but cars were becoming more and more common for the general population. And so Stephen Mather knew it was important to have a road through Glacier National Park. And of course, what he ended up with is going to the Sun Road. That's a road that took many years of planning and then construction. It was completed in the fall of 1932 and dedicated with a grand celebration in 1933. And our Going to the Sun Road is really special in the National Park Service in that it was the first road to be built in a national park where the priority wasn't just getting from point A to point B, but the mission of that road was to actually give visitors an aesthetic experience, a unique national park experience as they drove that road. And I think that any of us who have driven Going to the Sun Road can appreciate that they succeeded with that mission here in Glacier National Park. So into the 30s, the emphasis was still on getting people out into national parks and providing visitation services to people. And what became important throughout the nation was the work of the Civilian Conservation Corps. So the CCC was set up as a work program to give work to young men who needed work and needed to send money back to their families. And national parks nationwide, as well as state parks and other agencies, benefited greatly by the CCC that went into these areas, built trails, built roads, built infrastructure. Here in Glacier National Park, we had 13 different CCC camps at various times during the 1930s. They did some trail building. They did some removal of snags from trees that had burned in forest fires, which is a way that ideas have changed. We don't do that today. And that bottom picture is actually showing a CCC crew putting in a phone line to Logan Pass. If you've hiked up to the Hidden Lake Overlook, that's the route that they put that phone line. Unfortunately, it did not survive the winter avalanches, and there's still no phone service at Logan Pass. The next big project in national parks was a program called Mission 66. Mission 66 was a program to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service. So it was a 10-year program that went from 1956 concluding in 1966. Mission 66 put a lot of money into national parks, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of utilities, a lot of employee housing. And what you're most likely to notice today in national parks throughout the country are the unique Mission 66 architecture visitor centers. So here in Glacier National Park, both the Logan Pass Visitor Center and this building that we're sitting in right now at St. Mary were buildings that were funded and designed as part of Mission 66. After Mission 66, there was a bit of a switch in park management. Now, there had been scientists working for the National Park Service since the beginning, but for the most part, when they had pushed for management to be looking at science, they didn't really get that much attention. So it wasn't until the late 60s or early 70s that national parks started to be managed with more of a look towards ecosystems and science. You know, 1970 was the first Earth Day, so it was a whole change in the way that people were thinking about and being aware of natural systems, working together as ecosystems. Because things had really changed a lot in the national parks. This was back in the good old days or bad old days when emphasis was on visitor entertainment at whatever cost. This is actually Horace Albright when he was the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park, and the thing to do was to picnic with the bears. This is again during Albright's tenure in Yellowstone when President Calvin Coolidge came to visit the park, and if the US president came to a national park, you wanted to get his picture taken with basically tame bears in developed areas. It was kind of like a circus in these areas. The part of this photograph that kills me is the guy on the right, the Secret Serviceman with the big hat. You would not mess with this gentleman. So the emphasis with wildlife management was very much its entertainment value for people, and entertainment in a circus kind of way. Here's a picture straight out of Glacier National Park. This is Many Glacier where I live. Many Glacier Hotel was built on a ridge where we have archaeological evidence that shows that native people were hunting bighorn sheep thousands of years ago. So we have sheep migration routes that have gone through there all these years. So the Many Glacier Hotel was built in 1915, and suddenly we decided we needed to help those poor sheep. We didn't know how they'd been surviving for thousands of years without us. And so this is a caretaker at the Many Glacier Hotel whose job from the Park Service instructions was to actually feed the bighorn sheep in the winter. Well, they had been doing fine for thousands of years, and ironically enough, this program did not serve them well at all, because it brought all these bighorn sheep into very close proximity. Bighorn sheep, of course, they're most stressed during the winter. They're very susceptible to lung diseases, and they ended up transmitting and sharing those diseases, and there was a massive die-off of that herd because of the feeding program. So well-intentioned, but it didn't work out so well. Another way that things have changed, in those early years, especially the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there was very much a value system with wildlife where the American public, and therefore park managers, really considered there to be good wildlife and bad wildlife. So good wildlife were animals like the sheep and the goats, the deer, and the elk, and the moose. And bad wildlife were the animals that preyed upon the good ones. So park rangers were actually sent out on these predator control missions for decades to hunt the predatory animals in the parks. And of course, since then we've come to realize the important role that each of those animals has in a natural ecosystem. And today we really do try to manage wildlife as natural beings going about their natural behaviors, whether that Columbian ground squirrel believes it or not. And the majority of the public today really does value seeing wildlife in a natural habitat with its natural behaviors. We can go to zoos to see animals up close, but national parks are places where people today want natural situations with wildlife. So we have these national parks, they're vast, beautiful, protected areas, and I think sometimes we get lulled into a complacency of thinking that national parks are so special that they're protected into perpetuity. But it's important to realize that national parks are established because they have value and significance to a group of people with some power, and they only continue to be protected if they continue to have that kind of value and significance to people in power. Some things have changed over the years. You know that Yellowstone is the country's first national park. Do you know what this is? This is the second national park established in the United States. Anybody know where this is? This is Mackinac Island, Mackinac National Park. It existed from 1875 until 1895. But remember, that was the era before the National Park Service. There wasn't really funding, there wasn't budget for national parks. So Mackinac National Park was just sort of an added-on duty to an Army base, an Army fort that was right there on Mackinac Island. So when the Army closed the fort, there wasn't anyone to look after the national park, and so the federal government gave it to the state of Michigan. So it became Michigan's first state park and was lost to the federal system. Here in Montana, the same thing happened. Lewis and Clark Cavern National Monument existed as part of our system from 1908 until 1937. Lewis and Clark Caverns is down by Three Forks, Montana, and it never really had any budget as a federally controlled area. It never really had any visitor services, and so in 1937, the National Park Service gave it to the state of Montana as a state park. So you can go there today, but it's operated by the state of Montana. And then there are just the tragic stories. One of them would be the story of Fossil Cycad National Monument. So this is a national monument that existed from 1922 until 1957. It was established because it was considered to have some of the best fossil evidence in North America. These cycad trees were like giant ferns. And apparently, when the park was first established, or the National Monument was first established, there were fossils, massive fossils, all over the ground in this area near the Black Hills. Well, again, they didn't really have a budget. They didn't have anybody overseeing the area. There was never a visitor center. There was never really any services for visitors. And by 1957, there were absolutely no fossils left. There was nothing left to protect because it really hadn't been protected at all. And so this national monument was decommissioned because there was nothing to protect. And then there are just the weird stories. Mar-a-Lago National Historic Site in Florida. This was a huge estate that was left to the federal government by an heiress whose intent was that this would be an area, this would be a place as a presidential retreat in Florida. But the National Park Service never really asked for it. Have you ever gotten a gift you didn't ask for and you didn't really want? So what do you do with it? Regift. Yeah, so Mar-a-Lago belonged to the National Park Service from 1972 until 1980. That seemed like a decent amount of time to sit back and basically just keep it in mothball state. It would have cost so much money for the National Park Service to operate this place that they never did anything with it. And in 1980, we turned around and gave it back to the family, which had left it in the will to the National Park Service in the first place, and it went on the open market, and it's now owned by Donald Trump. Right. So here's your quiz. Let's see how familiar you are with the National Park Service. Now remember, while there are 59 units called national parks, there are actually 412 units to the National Park Service. So does anybody know what the newest NPS unit is? Holler out if you know. It's been fairly recent news. I had to change this program since the summer began. The newest National Park Service unit is Stonewall National Monument in New York City, established in late June of this year. How about the largest NPS unit? Oh, I hear some that are close. I heard the right state. Yeah, Alaska. There you go, somebody said it. Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska at 13.2 million acres. Glacier is 1 million acres. How about the smallest NPS unit? I'm still looking for someone who's actually been there. Thaddeus Kosciuszko National Memorial in Philadelphia at 0.02 acres. I'm not sure if it includes the whole house or just one bedroom. But this is a national memorial to a Polish citizen who was actually a great friend to the cause in the Revolutionary War. And so this memorializes his efforts, and it's a place where he stayed in a boarding house for a few months. And I've looked at their website. They are open during the summer, on weekends, from noon until 4. How about the most visited NPS unit? Not Yellowstone. Remember, where's all the population? There you go. So as a unit, it would be the Blue Ridge Parkway at over 15 million visitors last year. As an actual national park, it is Great Smoky Mountains, because that's where the Blue Ridge Parkway ends up, at almost 11 million visitors last year. And we'll see what all these numbers are after our record visitation this year. How about the least visited NPS unit? Believe it or not, it's not Thaddeus Kosciuszko. It's Aniakchak National Monument and Preserve in Alaska. They got 153 visitors last year. So one of the fun things about these national parks is they get preserved for one set of values. Glacier National Park was set aside in 1910 because it was a beautiful place with impressive mountains, grand lakes, and quite frankly, because it had glaciers you could get to. But then national parks end up protecting all sorts of values that were never thought of at the time that they were first established. Nobody knew about this little stonefly that lived in the meltwaters of the glaciers in Glacier National Park. Now we know that this is an organism that's only been found here in Glacier National Park. So there are so many things that can teach us something and have value today that weren't even known about back then. And then there are values like sounds. When Glacier was established, nobody thought the sound of natural waters or birds singing was a significant value. But today, we live in a country that's filled with noise, man-made, in all sorts of different places. And so natural soundscapes are important values in national parks. And today we monitor those natural sounds in the backcountry of Glacier, as well as in the front country and along the roads, to have an idea of what is being changed by human impact, so that maybe in the future we'll be able to regulate some of those things or manage them a little bit better. Other values that people weren't thinking about 100 years ago would be things like the value of the night skies. You know, that was something that people used to just take for granted. And of course, now we know that Most of the people in this country, if not the world, live in places where they can't see the Milky Way at night. And so the value of these pristine night skies is something that has become significant in national parks. And some people come to Glacier and other national parks specifically to get an opportunity to see the Milky Way and appreciate those night skies. Here in Glacier, we have opportunities to view the night skies in the evening out here in the parking lot. If you stick around after the program and wait until dark, there will be an opportunity to look through telescopes with our park astronomers out there. We have star parties up at Logan Pass to celebrate and observe the night skies. And we're especially excited in Glacier because we are just days away from actually getting a special designation with Waterton Lakes National Park, our sister park in Alberta, as the first transboundary international dark sky preserve, recognizing that these parks do give people an opportunity to appreciate the night skies, and that also we're being challenged in making sure that we improve our night sky viewing by improving our lighting so that it is not causing light pollution. Another value that really wasn't being thought about 100 years ago with national parks would be the economic value. Now, I live in real life in the Flathead Valley on the other side of the park, and it's interesting because if you look at the editorials from the local newspapers down there in the years when they were talking about establishing a national park, people in the local areas did not want a national park here because they were very concerned that having a national park would actually restrict economic growth for this area. The reality is that in places, not only northwest Montana, but pretty much any place close to a national park, these parks today are economic drivers, which the local community is largely dependent on. And they're dependent on it because of the increasing populations that are coming to these national parks, which really gives us a whole new set of situations and challenges in national parks, things that Mather and Albright never worried about. Remember, they were just trying to get enough people out into national parks to actually get attention to those places. But today, national parks are sometimes referred to as being loved to death, and of course, we're seeing increased visitation. Here in Glacier, we have seen an almost 14% increase in visitation through the end of July compared to last year at this time. And so parks like Zion have instituted things like the mandatory shuttle system to get into the valley there. Places like Yosemite have actually had to put in lotteries to get permits to do things like climb Half Dome. This is what it used to be to get up between those cables, just a mob scene getting up there. It's not quite that crowded anymore because now to make this climb, you have to put into a lottery, and if you're lucky, you'll get a permit for this activity. And here in Glacier, any of you who have driven Going to the Sun Road and tried to find a parking place at Logan Pass know that we're dealing with the same sorts of issues in Glacier National Park right now. So we have actually been going through a Going to the Sun Road corridor research program, and we're awaiting results on that as far as what our preferred alternative will be for future management of the Going to the Sun Road corridor. So we have all these national parks throughout the area, or throughout the country, and they're not all national parks. Like I said, 59 of the 412 units are called national parks, but we have a great variety of designations of areas protected and managed by the National Park Service. Now, some of these names are descriptive of the areas they protect. Some of them are very similar to others, and they just really have to do with the legislation that originally established these national parks. But all of these areas have been set aside by our federal government in recognition of something special about these places. In some cases, there's scenic beauty, such as Glacier Park. In some cases, it's stories that we're preserving, historic spots. In some cases, it's stories that, as the American population, we're very proud to protect and retell. And in some cases, there are stories that are being protected that we really are sorry we have to remember and retell, but they're stories that are considered vital to be kept alive in our country's memory. So I'm not going to show you all 412 units of the National Park Service. We don't quite have time for that. But let's spend a few minutes just being awed by the great variety that we have within our national park system. So it really is a system that Americans can be proud of. And it's a system that really was created as the system we know today by these two men, Stephen Mather and Horace Albright. And while these were administrators back in Washington, D.C., they're also very connected to us here in Glacier National Park. The year before the Park Service was established, in 1915, Albright and Mather came on a sort of a fact-finding trip to many of the national parks in the West. And on that trip in 1915, in September, they came to Glacier National Park. They started out over in the Lake McDonald area. They went to what's today Lake McDonald Lodge. Actually, they had had quite an experience earlier in the day because they had gone to the park headquarters, which at that time was basically a log cabin at Fish Creek, accessed by a terribly rutted, horrible road. And Mather was so appalled by the conditions of the headquarters and the road to get there that he ended up personally purchasing the land where our current park headquarters is and donating that to the National Park Service. So that real estate transaction took some time, and they got a late start on their horseback trip on this day in September 1915. So they started out late in the afternoon at Lake McDonald Lodge, riding horses up to their first night's destination, which was going to be Sperry Chalet. Now, it was a miserable afternoon. It was raining when they started and quickly turned to snow, wet snow, cold and wet snow. And as Horace Albright told in later years, there was nothing pleasant about it. He was miserable. He was not enjoying anything about Glacier National Park. They approached Sperry Chalet and they got there right about dark, but it didn't look like this because remember, they couldn't see anything. There were clouds right down to the ground. It was cold, they were wet, they were miserable. They went into their rooms and Horace Albright said he just went to sleep hoping to forget the whole experience. The next morning, he woke up and he said he was afraid to even open his eyes because he didn't want a repeat of the misery of the day before. But when he did open his eyes and look out the window of his room at Sperry Chalet, he found that the world had changed. The sun was out. There were mountains. It was a beautiful place. And Horace Albright later wrote that he went out onto the deck there at Sperry Chalet. He took in the view. He was just in awe. And as he sat there on the deck, he was joined by Stephen Mather. The two of them just took it in silence. Then Stephen Mather turned to Horace Albright, and as Albright wrote many years later, Stephen Mather said these words. He said, "Horace, what God-given opportunity has come our way to preserve wonders like these before us. We must never forget or abandon our gift." And so I feel like those words that Stephen Mather said here in Glacier National Park 101 years ago really do echo down through the years to us today. Because while the National Park Service of today has changed in many ways, and Mather and Albright really wouldn't recognize many parts of it today, the big ideas remain. The big ideas that they started reverberate through the years. We have continued to preserve the special places and tell the compelling stories. And we continue to hold these places in trust for those future generations. Let us never forget or abandon our gift. Thank you. So get out there.